Okay, so now we enter into the second part of the crucifixion and the resurrection in the Quran, chapter 4, verse 157. In the first video, I argued, I stated facts about the Q Gospel, how the Q Gospel talked about Jesus' assumption into heaven, how a scholar named Daniel A. Smith argues that Jesus was taken alive from the tomb into heaven, thus, Jesus survived the crucifixion. So now I'm going to be talking about I'm going to be doing a second part where I where I explain what the Quran, chapter 4, verse 157, is talking about, and how this ties into the earliest form or the earliest tradition of Christianity. So basically, in the first video, I talked about the empty tomb. So basically, atheist scholars, etc., atheist scholars of Christianity, etc., would argue against the empty tomb. Now, I read William Lane Craig over the years. So like basically, what evidence do we have for the empty tomb? What I'll do is I will let world famous Christian apologist William Lane Craig answer that in a video I found on William Lane Craig's ministry. So I'll let William Lane Craig and provide some evidence for the empty tomb.
What evidence is there for the empty tomb?
In my book, I lay out about 10 lines of evidence for the empty tomb, so I couldn't possibly hope to summarize it all here. Let me just mention a couple of points. One of the most important facts, I think, undergirding the empty tomb is, oddly enough, the burial story of Jesus. If the burial story of Jesus is accurate, then that means that the site of Jesus' tomb was known to both Jew and Christian alike in Jerusalem. But if that is the case, then it seems to me that the inference that the tomb was found empty is very near at hand. For if the burial site of Jesus were known, then it would have been impossible for the disciples to believe in the resurrection of Jesus and proclaim this in Jerusalem when Jesus' corpse still lay in the tomb. If Christianity or the resurrection was preached in Jerusalem itself, as it was, the very city where Jesus was publicly executed, where his grave remained and was publicly known, the disciples could not possibly have believed that he was risen from the dead in the face of a closed tomb. And even if they had, scarcely anybody else would have believed in them if they proclaimed anything so silly. For a first century Jew, the idea that you could have a spiritual resurrection while the corpse still lay on the tomb was simply unknown. That is an invention of 20th century theology, not first century Judaism. And in any case, the Jewish authorities certainly could have made an end to the whole affair by simply pointing to the closed tomb of Jesus and said, look, the grave is occupied, he is not risen from the dead, and that would have been the end of it. And therefore, the accuracy of the burial story, I think, provides powerful grounds for affirming the historicity of the empty tomb account. And unfortunately, for those who wish to deny the empty tomb, the burial of Jesus is widely recognized to be one of the most historically credible facts that we have about the historical person, Jesus of Nazareth. So that those who deny the empty tomb are also forced to deny the burial story, which is a desperate expedient since it is so historically well attested. So that would just be one aspect. Another aspect of the empty tomb narrative itself, as it's found in the Gospel of Mark, is that this portion of the narrative was probably part of Mark's early source material that he used for describing the passion and the death of Jesus, the last week of Jesus' life and his crucifixion. The burial story marked the close of the passion of Jesus as he is laid in the tomb and the stone is rolled across its entrance. And the empty tomb story was probably part of that passion story because that story would not have been circulated without victory at its end. Without the empty tomb, the passion story is incomplete. Also, the empty tomb story is connected to the burial account by syntactical and linguistic ties. For example, the pronouns used in the empty tomb story have their antecedents in the burial story, so that it's really one smooth account. Now, when you remember that Mark is the earliest of our Gospels, that means that his source material was even older. And this passion narrative that included the empty tomb story could have gone back to within the AD 30s even. Remember, Jesus was crucified about AD 30. So that we're talking about a source that is extremely old and is therefore a valuable source of historical information. Also, the empty tomb story itself, thirdly, is extremely simple and lacks any signs of legendary development. I think the best way to appreciate this would be to compare it to accounts of the empty tomb that are found in apocryphal Gospels, that is, forgeries dating from the 2nd century, such as the so-called Gospel of Peter. In the Gospel of Peter, the narrative describes the resurrection of Jesus itself coming out of the tomb. The narrative proceeds by saying that during the night, there is a loud voice that rings out from heaven, and then the stone across the entrance to the tomb rolls back by itself. Then 2 men are seen coming out of heaven and going into the tomb. Then 3 men come out of the tomb, 2 of them holding up the 3rd man. The heads of the 2 men stretch up to the clouds, but the head of the 3rd man overpasses the clouds. Then a cross comes out of the tomb, and a voice from heaven asks, "Hast thou preached to them that sleep?" And the cross answers, "Yea." Now, these are how real legends look. You see, they're colored by all sorts of theological and apologetical motifs. And these are noticeably lacking from the Mark and empty tomb account, which seems to be basically a straightforward report of what actually happened. If I might just mention a couple of other points that I think are significant. The empty tomb was probably discovered by women. And I think that this is evident when you contemplate 2 aspects of the role of women in first century Jewish society. First of all, women occupied, quite frankly, a low rung on the Jewish social ladder. They were second-class citizens in first century Palestine. This is evident from such Jewish rabbinical sayings as the following: "Sooner let the words of the law be burnt than delivered to women." Or again, "Woe to him whose children are female, but blessings on him whose children are male." Women were not as highly regarded as males in that society. Secondly, the witness of women was regarded as so worthless that they were not even allowed to serve as witnesses in a legal court of law. If a man were seen committing a crime by a group of women, he could not be convicted on the basis of their testimony because their witness was thought to be so unreliable that it wouldn't even be admitted into court. Now, in light of those 2 facts, how remarkable must it be that the empty tomb story describes the discovery of the empty tomb by women? The fact that it is women rather than men who discover Jesus' tomb empty suggests that this is a historically credible account. Any later legend would have certainly made the male disciples to discover the empty tomb, Peter and John, for example. The fact that it is women that discovered the empty tomb, women whose witness was worthless and counted for nothing, is best explained by the fact that, like it or not, they were the ones who found the empty tomb, and the Gospels faithfully record this fact. One final piece of evidence that might be mentioned would be the fact that the earliest Jewish polemic or anti-Christian propaganda itself presupposes the empty tomb. The earliest Jewish polemic that was launched against the Christian proclamation, "He is risen from the dead," was to state that the disciples came by night and stole away his body. And then the Christians responded to that there was a guard at the tomb and they would have prevented the theft and so on and so forth. Now, the interesting thing in this dispute is not the historicity of the presence of the guard. Rather, the interesting thing is what the Jewish polemic was saying in response to the Christian proclamation, "He is risen from the dead." Were they saying, these men are drunk with new wine, or his tomb is still out there on the hillside? No, they were saying the disciples came and stole away his body. Now think about that for a minute. What that implies is that the body was missing. The earliest Jewish polemic was itself an attempt to explain away the empty tomb. And thus we have evidence for the empty tomb, which comes not from the Christians, but from the very enemies of the earliest Christians themselves, which is historical evidence of first-rate quality, because it comes not from the sources which believed in the resurrection, but from those which disputed it. So on the basis of reasons like this, and many others, the majority of New Testament critics today affirm the historicity of the empty tomb story.
Okay, so you've seen the evidence for the empty tomb, or the reasons, or good reasons for believing in the empty tomb. So basically, now let me explain how it ties into my theory of Jesus' disappearance from that tomb. So uh, before before I get into the deeper, before I get into the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and how this connects to Jesus' disappearance rather than appearance from the tomb. Uh, there's a very important passage in the New Testament. We read in 2 Peter chapter 1 verse 16. All right, let me just read it real quick. All right, so 2 Peter chapter 1 verse 16 says, we did not follow cleverly invented stories when we are told about the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses to his majesty. So basically, 2 Peter chapter 1 verse 16 shows that there were Christians, early Christians from the first generation, who are, the time of the disciples, who were teaching that the gospels were cleverly devised myths. What is the gospel according to Paul? The earliest form of the gospel preached by Paul, during the first generation of Christians, first generation meaning the disciples and the disciples of the disciples, was the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. So there were first generation of Christians. There were Christians who were from the time of the apostles or from the time of the disciples, or the second generation, the generation after the disciples, of Christians who believed that Jesus' death and resurrection was a myth, not a historical fact. So notice what 2 Peter chapter 1 verse 16 is saying. It's saying we did not follow cleverly devised myths. We were eyewitnesses to his majesty. Then immediately forges an eyewitness account of meeting Jesus on earth to answer otherwise unknown Christians who were claiming such a Jesus was a cleverly devised myth. 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 1. So what this entails is that 2 Peter chapter 1 verse 16 shows that there were Christians who were teaching that the Gospels were cleverly devised myths. In other words, they weren't historical realities. They were myth. They were fiction. What is the gospel according? What are the gospel they're talking about? What is the gospel according to Paul? The gospel according to Paul is the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. So there were first generation Christians, Christians during the time of the disciples, and the second generation, the second generation of Christians who came immediately after the disciples, who were probably taught by the disciples of Jesus, who believed that Jesus' death and resurrection was a myth, not a historical fact. So in the earliest days of Christianity, the crucified and resurrected Jesus was seen as a myth. The crucified and resurrected Jesus was seen as a cleverly devised myth. See 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 1. So this shows that in the earliest days of Christianity, the crucified and resurrected Jesus was seen as a myth and not a historical fact that came from the disciples. It was most likely a myth invented by Paul when he preached his version of the Gospels to the Gentiles. Keep in mind, it was Paul who first propagated Jesus' death by crucifixion and resurrection, not the disciples. So Paul was the first one who preached who was the first and only one who preached Jesus' death by crucifixion and resurrection. It was not the disciples who were preaching and teaching that. Paul also says where he got his gospel of Jesus' death and resurrection from. He got his version of the gospel from Paul's own visions and revelations, and from his reading of Scripture. Scripture back then was the Old Testament, or forms of the Old Testament, whether it's Old Testament Apocrypha or Old Testament books we can find in the Old Testament today. For evidence for this, see Galatians chapter 1, verse 11 to 12, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 1 to 8, 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 23. And there are many other verses, but these will suffice for now. So basically, now let's go into the Gospels. Like I said before, in all of the Gospel accounts, nobody sees Jesus rise from the dead. They only observe a missing body and are later visited. William Lane Craig wisely sidesteps this issue by focusing on this empty tomb. So what about the appearances? Now, if we start, let's start with the Gospel of Mark. The fact of the matter is, the ending of the Gospel of Mark, everything after the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, verse 8, does not actually exist in the earliest versions of that Gospel. It was the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, verses 9 to 20, was added sometime in the late 2nd century or even later. Before that, as far as we can tell, the Gospel of Mark ended at verse 8. So the Gospel of Mark ended at the Gospel of Mark chapter 16, verse 8. But that means the Gospel of Mark ended only with the empty tomb and the announcement by the mysterious young man. The mysterious young man in white in the Gospel of Mark chapter 16 is interpreted to be an angel. So like I said before, and this is the important part, that in all the gospel accounts, nobody sees Jesus rise from the dead. They only observe a missing body and are later visited. So what about the appearances? So now we get to the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So let's start with the Gospel of Mark, since the Gospel of Mark, according to Christian scholars like William Lane Craig, etc., is the earliest Gospel. So we start with the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark ended in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, verse 8. In verses 16, the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, verses 9 to 20, is actually not in the earliest Greek versions of that Gospel that survive. The Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, verses 9 to 20, was added sometime in the late 2nd century or even later. Before that, as far as we can tell, the Gospel of Mark ended at Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, verse 8. But that means the Gospel of Mark ended only with an empty tomb and the proclamation of a mysterious young man. The mysterious young man is interpreted to be an angel in the later Gospels of Matthew, Luke, and John. So what about the appearances? So basically, if we read the Gospel of Mark, the attached ending to the Gospel of Mark, if we read the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, verse 12, it records that Jesus appeared in a different form. The Greek verb used is phenero, in a passive voice, which means he was made known, he was revealed, or he became known, became famous. So that Greek word phenero, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing it, the choice of the verb suggests and certainly allows that it is a vision being described. So according to the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, verse 12, that Greek verb suggests that the disciples or the the women followers and the disciples were seeing a vision and not like a flesh and body Jesus. And if we go to the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 28, verse 17, reports that only some people who actually saw Jesus worshipped him, while others doubted it was him. Um, so, uh, so basically, why would someone who saw Jesus doubt it was him? The other Gospels provide clues that explain this, which also make the appearances of Jesus doubtful in their own right. Jesus did not look like the pre-crucified uh, Jesus, but the post-crucified Jesus, or the supposed resurrected Jesus, looked like someone they did not recognize. Then we go to the Gospel of Luke. So in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, verse 16, it records that Jesus appeared to two men, Cleophas, who's probably Peter, based on the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, verse 13, verse 18, and verse 34. But they did not recognize Jesus. Even after talking with him, inviting him to his home, and eating dinner with him. So basically, after Jesus' crucifixion, and when Jesus appears to the disciples don't recognize what they're seeing. They don't recognize the full, like, pre-crucified flesh and blood Jesus. So basically, this is further proof that that it was a very visionary appearance that the disciples were looking at after the crucifixion and after the empty tomb story. Uh, so basically, when they see Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, they quickly lose sight of this vision. This could mean that hang on, let me. They only conclude. So basically, when the disciples see Jesus, they conclude it's Jesus based on Jesus' words and behavior in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, verses 31 to 32. So if you read the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, verse 31 to 32, many translators say that they recognized him, and then Jesus vanishes, and as if something happened. The Greek is more mundane. So if you read the Greek, it says that their eyes were open and they recognized him, and he became hidden from them. So basically, after the empty tomb, they're seeing Jesus, and then Jesus vanishes, and then they see him again. So this is further indication that the post crucified Jesus who came to the disciples was a vision, and not like the flesh and blood Jesus. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, verses 36 to 50, it shows that it shows that Jesus' appearances are becoming increasingly elaborate from none at all in the original Gospel of Mark, to the vague account in Matthew, to Luke. So basically, there's an evolution from the Gospel of Mark to Matthew to Luke. So this shows that the disciples didn't recognize the post crucified Jesus. So now we go to the Gospel of John. So like the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, in the Gospel of John, people don't recognize the post-crucified and post-empty tomb Jesus. In the Gospel of John, chapter 20, verse 14, it records that Mary Magdalene, too, sees Jesus but does not know it is him. So basically, the Mary Magdalene doesn't recognize this post-crucified, post-empty tomb Jesus. So this is further indication that it was a vision that they were seeing. If we read in, hang on one second, let me see if I find my place. So basically, Mary Magdalene first assumes that Jesus is a gardener. Then she falls into his arms weeping in the Gospel of John, chapter 20, verses 13 to 17, and takes him to be Jesus. So basically, she doesn't recognize at first who she's talking to. All this suggests a vision, or at least that what she saw was not Jesus, but some but some other form of Jesus, not like the physical flesh and blood. Like, I'm a flesh and blood person, not like a flesh and blood Jesus. Basically, we see like an evolution as to how that happens. So basically, if we read the Gospel of John, chapter 20, verse 19, the Gospel of John, chapter 20, verse 19, it records that when Jesus appeared to the others, it is after Mary Magdalene's impassioned story, while they're all mourning and have locked themselves indoors in fear of the Jews. So basically, this is further indication that this is a vision that they're seeing post crucifixion, post empty tomb, a vision of Jesus they're seeing. It's not like the pre crucified Jesus. It's a very visionary appearance. It's not like a flesh and blood Jesus they're seeing, a flesh and blood resurrected Jesus. In the Gospel of John chapter 21 verse 4 records that when Jesus appeared outside, but on that occasion his own disciples again did not know it is him. So basically, according to the Gospel of John, when Jesus post crucifixion and post empty tomb Jesus, the disciples don't recognize him. One disciple, the one Jesus loved, was resting on Jesus' chest during the Last Supper. Gospel of John chapter 13 verse 23, in the Gospel of John chapter 21 verse 20 merely says it is Jesus, and Peter swims ashore, presumably to see for sure. But when they all come to eat with this with this post empty tomb Jesus, in the Gospel of John chapter 21 verse 12 says that none of them dared to ask him, "Who are you?" knowing that he was the Lord. So why would they feel the need to ask him who he was unless it was not obvious to them? So the Greek word uses tolmeo, which means to be brave enough to dare. So basically, the disciples didn't recognize this Jesus that appeared to them after the crucifixion. So this shows that this shows that the way the Gospel of John is written, the Gospel of John, the ending of the Gospel of John, the Gospel of John chapter 21 is written. It shows that the flesh and blood Jesus did not appear to Peter and the disciples. Ultimately, the way the passage is written is odd enough to cast great doubt on other interpretations, which confirms what the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John share in common, that when Jesus appeared post-crucifixion, post-empty tomb, he looked like someone else, not the flesh and blood Jesus. So he looked like a vision. So it's my theory that God or Allah showed a vision to the disciples, Peter, James, John, etc., post crucifixion, post empty tomb, and didn't recognize they didn't recognize this vision of Jesus because it was different from the pre-crucified Jesus. So basically, the other claim being made forth to claim that Jesus died by crucifixion and was resurrected was the claim that the disciples died for their faith in Jesus. So the claim of Christian apologists like William Lane Craig, Josh McDowell, David Wood, Mike Licona, Gary Hermas, like whatever Christian apologist out there, they'll always make the claim that Jesus' disciples died for their faith in Jesus' death and resurrection. So basically, I did an interview with Dr. Richard Carrier on the historicity of Jesus back in 2016, and I will let him answer this question as this video will come to a close. Brings me to my next question. I know Christian apologists like to say the disciples died for their belief in the resurrection and the death of Jesus, and this is like a big thing. However, you have debunked that claim, you and Bart Ehrman. But can you briefly comment on the death of them? Do we have reliable sources that talk about them believing the resurrection and then dying for that?
Yeah. No. Basically, the only death that we have a reference to someone dying for witnessing for Christ, but it doesn't get any more specific as to what they were witnessing to, what they were saying. They died for the gospel, but what was the gospel they were preaching at the time? It is Paul, and that's in 1 Clement. 1 Clement referred, but Paul didn't know Jesus personally, right? And Paul saw Jesus in a vision, as Paul himself says, right? So Paul died for a vision.
So nothing in the New Testament says that they died for their belief?
No. The only death that's in the New Testament of one of the disciples, or one of the inner core of the so-called 12, is one of the Jameses, and it just says that he was killed. It doesn't say like that he could have recanted and gotten away, or what gospel he was killed for, or what he was killed for, or anything. It just says he was killed, right? And even that, might not necessarily be a true story. And that's it, really. So after that, it's just legends. We know Peter died. We know, for example, 1 Clement refers to Peter dying, but he doesn't say why or where or for what purpose. Or what gospel he died for, or if he died for any gospel, he might have died of old age or whatever. So we just don't have decent data on what they died for, when they died, and that's it. So it's you really can't build much of a case out of that, right?
Okay.